Real Cyberpunk Academy as opposed to like a rusting flagship. This would be like the #1 textbook. You can get it online right now. Temporary Autonomous Zone by Hawking Bay has an entire chapter, or part of a chapter, which is about Rijeka as a pirate utopia. So here we are on a rusty boat, you know, you're looking at it. It obviously been a long time since Marshal Tito was alive, about 50 years. Okay, if you take it 50 years back beyond that, 100 years, almost 100 years ago, there was an earlier period where Rijeka, this little town, was the world capital of piracy. In the period of 1919 to 1920, truly amazing and extraordinary things were happening in that very town. Rijeka was an independent state. There was a period of about 16 months when this little city-state was the most politically radical place in the world. It was a kind of hippie raver utopia of free sex, cheap drugs, and music, and daggers and hand grenades. Lots of daggers and hand grenades. But Rijeka was literally occupied. It was a center of piracy, and I don't mean like soft-hearted Swedish software piracy. I mean real piracy, stealing large boats and cars and entire herds of horses. Literal pirates in this town. They had their headquarters right up the hill there. And now, why was Rijeka a pirate haven full of sex, drugs, music, and young people? A pirate utopia with its own constitution, its own postal service, its own navy, its own air force, and high technology for the period. All right, you might say they can't possibly be pirates because they didn't have crypto. They had crypto. Oh, they couldn't possibly be pirates because they didn't have high technology. Yes, they did have high technology. Marconi, the inventor of the radio, Guglielmo Marconi, was an honorary citizen of Rijeka in this period, the Regenza di Carnaro, as they called it. Marconi came to this city, he came into this harbor with his own yacht. He got off the yacht, he became a citizen of the Regency of Carnaro, as well as being a senator of Italy, and he got a divorce here. He divorced his wife because he couldn't stand her and he wasn't allowed to divorce her under the laws of Italy. So he got a divorce, and in his sheer gratitude, he gave Rijeka its own pirate radio propaganda station. One of the first radio propaganda stations in the world. It's historical truth. You can look it up. So, sex, music, drugs, high technology, 1919. Okay, you're young people here, naturally you're wondering about the sex. Why would Rijeka be a world capital of sexual liberation? Because it was. It was probably the sexiest place in the world in 1919. Well, it was pretty simple because the guy who was in charge of the Rijeka occupation camp was an Italian poet. He was 57 years old at the time, but he was having as much sex as Berlusconi. Yeah,
there was a wind.
Yeah, okay, there's a wind, all right. Only he was more honest about it because being a poet, he wrote a lot of poetry about all the sex he was having. He was a married guy. He never divorced his wife, unlike Marconi, and he was a Catholic. But he brought his girlfriend, the musician here, a concert pianist from Venice, half his age, gorgeous woman, Louisa. And, Louisa was the musician, and she was having sex with the political radical who was the dictator of Occupation Fiume. She was the queen of occupied Fiume. And they were just brazening it out. So, it was pretty much a case of like it or get out of town. And that just sort of broke the back of the sexual conservatives in the town. After all, if that's good enough for our commander, Gabriele D'Annunzio, then free love and free sex are good enough for me. Let's just all have sex with the women of Rijeka or whoever is available. And the women of Rijeka are notoriously pretty. I mean, it's odd that I would say this. It sounds like a compliment, but actually people have been saying that the women of Rijeka are gorgeous for about 400 years. You can go back in the historical record. You can see people like carrying on about how pretty Rijeka women are and how happy they are to use their wiles to get their way. It's all true. You can look it all up. There it is, okay? All right, we've now talked about the sex, which was pretty embarrassing, so let's get right down to the drugs, an even more embarrassing topic. It's all true, it really happened here. What kind of drugs? Cocaine. Cocaine, the miracle wonder drug of 1919. Why were they doing a lot of cocaine in Rijeka in 1919? Well, it had everything to do with warplane pilots. Gabriele D'Annunzio, noted warplane pilot, had a lot of military buddies who joined him in the occupation here. They'd all been taking cocaine while fighting the Austrians in their biplanes and zeppelins. You needed to snort cocaine. The planes were pretty slow. There was a good chance you'd fall asleep. They were hard to pilot. You needed to be super alert for 12, 14 hours up in these planes, bombing, dogfighting, and so forth. These guys were commonly rich guys. You know, a lot of them were barons, like the Red Baron. They could get all the coke they wanted. They could get it prescribed. So they were up in the air, snorting huge amounts of cocaine, out fighting in the aircraft, and they came back with major coke habits. Drugs are dangerous, but getting killed in a World War I is, of course, a lot more dangerous, so they didn't really consider that very risky. It was the biggest war mankind had ever seen. You won it by fighting faster than the other guy, so they had kind of a military advantage with all this crank they were snorting, and they brought back lots of it, and you know, the Italians did, in fact, win the First World War. Snorted a lot of cocaine. Was that a good idea? Probably not. The war wasn't that great an idea either. In 1919, Rijeka was full of Italian war veterans who'd just been demobilized. They didn't have ranks, they didn't have uniforms, but they were in a port and they could get cocaine. And they got lots. This was a very good place to get it. What was the political story there? I mean, why were people like going out of their heads in this small town? Well, it had everything to do with the League of Nations, which was the American New World Order of the time. This was President Woodrow Wilson. He was like fighting the war to end all wars. He's like, okay, the shooting is stopped. Let's come up with a comprehensive diplomatic solution to make the whole world global and peaceful. Okay, Americans super into this. Always doing this. Anytime there's a war, the terror is like coming out of the woodwork. All right, it's like the war on terror is over. Like, everything was going to be okay to us. Okay, there were places that were centers of opposition to the League of Nations. This was one of them. People in this town just didn't want to put up with it. They didn't like foreigners, didn't like Croats much, weren't very fond of Italians, didn't care for Austrians very much. They liked Hungarians. Why? I don't know. People of Rijeka thought, maybe, probably because the Hungarians were far away. They really liked Hungarians, but when they realized that they were pawns in the chessboard of world politics, and they'd simply been handed over from the Austro-Hungarian Empire to the new kingdom of Croats, Serbs, and Slovenes, they got very upset. Nobody asked us about this. How come we don't get a chance to vote? Why didn't anybody ask the permission of Rijeka? We're independent-minded people. We're gonna like just drop out of here. We'll find like some soldiers to come in and occupy the place and just make a terrible political fuss. Oddly enough, when the trouble more or less ended, the Americans were the ones who actually didn't like the League of Nations. The United States Senate refused to ratify the treaty. The Americans would not buy into their own world order. On the contrary, the Americans turned out to be more or less on the side of the people of Fiume and Rijeka. The U.S. never joined the League of Nations. The Americans couldn't stand their own world order, and the whole scheme just collapsed. But this was a place where they actually took up arms against it. Sex,
Right.
drugs, and music. So why music? Well, you know, Republika here is a music festival. We've got a music organizer here. All right, the Constitution of the Regenza of Carnero was based on music. It was the world's only musical political state. Rijeka. D'Annunzio was a poet. He thought music was very politically important. His girlfriend here was a musician. He thought that music was a great way to assemble people in large crowds, to get them to go out into the streets, to get them to share the same emotions, to get them to share the same cultural sensibility. It was like an exit festival that went on for 16 months. Radio and recorded music had barely existed. It was all about the political power of live music. Music had a central place in the life of the rebel community. The music here was bigger than the sex and the drugs, because the sex was just for an adventurous minority, and the drugs were not all that popular, but the music was absolutely for everybody. It was practically compulsory. So, sex, drugs, music, and piracy. Why were they pirates? Did they steal stuff? Yeah, they stole a lot of stuff. Why was Rijeka, Fiume, Regenza de Carnero, why was it full of piracy? Well, you know, it's a nice place, and generally it's full of honest people. They're not thieves. They're very capable and productive people, actually, in 1919. Shipbuilders had their own torpedo factory here. They had paper factories. It was a thriving port city. People had been living here for prehistoric times. They hadn't really been pirates. They were generally fishermen, farmers, vineyards, people in trade and commerce. It's a beautiful harbor, got fresh river in the water, plenty of sunshine, all you would need to eat. Why did they suddenly feel that they had to start stealing stuff? Well, they could no longer earn an honest living, that's why. They were under economic embargo. That's why they had to become pirates. You're not going to do what the League of Nations says. We're going to start cutting all our economic connections with you. We're going to just like cut you out of the world trade system. We're going to blockade your ports. We're going to shut down your railroads. We're going to shut down all your paper documentation and make you into globalized non-people. Their reply was, great powers, France, Britain, United States, Russia, go to hell. We're just going to start taking stuff, and they did. I mean, they tried to get some legal money, mostly through crowdsourcing. They were crowdsourcing fund drives in Italian newspapers and magazines. And they made some money that way, but did they actually steal stuff? Yeah. So more about pirates. Were they really pirates? Yeah. Were they really stealing stuff? Yeah. How'd they go about doing that, you would naturally want to know. Speedboats, mostly. Had a lot of speedboats kind of left over from the war, these like high-tech attack torpedo boats, kind of like the cigarette boats that people use to do human smuggling from Albania now. And they owned a bunch of these, and they were like ex-military guys, so they knew how to kind of tune them up. And they would just take them out into the Gulf and kind of hijack boats Somali style. But they also had an organized group in their little government, which was called the Department of Direct Action, which is kind of the Department of Scrounging. And they were just in the business of just kind of grabbing anything they could, looking through forgotten military things, embezzling stuff from the Italian army, swiping stuff off ships, pretty much anything they could do. And then they had a second department, which was the Department of Forgery, which existed mostly to make fake IDs and like fake requisition documents. So they could steal stuff, they could give people fake IDs, they could raise money with other groups, they could send people in and out of the city using fake IDs, bringing back all kinds of stolen stuff. They stole ships. They tried to ransom a ship for $12 million. They wanted the $12 million in order to attack the kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. They actually wanted to scale up. They thought that holding Rijeka was the first thing they would do, and the second thing they would do was cause a Balkan revolution. Break up the Serbs, the Croats, the Slovenes. They had mercenaries who were ready to go. They had plenty of guns. They had boats. They were going to start revolutions all up and down the Adriatic. They were hoping to take over most of the Adriatic and then march on Rome and take over Italy. That was the game plan. D'Annunzio was high on cocaine when he thought up this plan, but it was not that much weirder than Tito's plan. And Tito was a very little known guy, just a communist agitator who joined an army, in a country under occupation, and he ended up becoming the marshal and, basically the dictator of a quite large country for a long time. And, having Rijeka is not that much weirder than having Turkish Cyprus, which has been in the Mediterranean as a non-state since 1974. There's no government in Turkish Cyprus. It's sitting there right now. That wasn't that far-fetched an idea. It was less crazy than the ideas of a lot of people who were successful. Hitler was a crazier guy than D'Annunzio. Mussolini wasn't that practically minded a guy. Napoleon did weird stuff. Nobody knew who he was either. They were going to take over the Adriatic. They were going to march on Rome, and they were just going to start a gigantic, transcendent, sex, drugs, and rock and roll Italian international empire. People were afraid of him. They really thought he was going to win. Oh, if Snowden or Assange were looking for a place to hide right now, and they had the Rijeka de Carnero, that's where they'd go first thing. It's the Ecuador of its day. It's the Venezuela. It's the Iceland. What does this have to do with the internet? People were swarming into Rijeka in 1919. From all over the world, people were coming. They were trying to establish diplomatic relations with the Irish, with the Flemish, with black people in the USA. They were trying to find every ethnic group in the world that hated the League of Nations and start a gigantic international anti-League of Nations. There were even Americans and Japanese in Rijeka in 1919. So and now, you may wonder why an American is telling you all these things. And like, why does it have anything to do with like Assange and Snowden? Well, internet politics and national politics are not the same thing. So we got Assange, who's this guy who like severely embarrassed the U.S. State Department, and that was pretty bad. I mean, it was bad enough that he had to like retweet into the Ecuadorian embassy in downtown London, which is now like his private Rijeka of Carnaro in there. And then Snowden shows up and he embarrasses the NSA, which is 1,000 times worse. Because nobody cares about the State Department. Nobody pays any attention to them. Just other diplomats. To humiliate the biggest intelligence apparatus in the world, it's very humiliating. It's more complicated than it seems. I mean, Snowden is American intelligence. He's a spy. Whenever you're jumping up and saying, oh yeah, he's like one of us. Okay, he is like one of you. You people are a lot like the NSA, believe it or not. I've got fans in the NSA. I meet them at events. They're like, oh yeah, Mr. Sterling, love those cyberpunk books. They look like you. They talk like you. They have the look in your eyes. A lot of them are about your age. They went to the same schools you do. They understand what crypto is. If you use the word crypto, they're just all over you. They're on the networks like you. They're in the net like you. Some of you are probably talking to them. I don't doubt they're police agents in this group. They kind of have to be. This has been going on a long time. Even D'Annunzio had an American guy with him, Henry I. Nobody's ever heard of him. Super interesting guy. He's like the token American in the Rijeka Revolution. He was there. The Americans are always there. Wherever there's anti-Americans, there's always Americans. D'Annunzio's allies were mostly pro-American. All these guys who were like supposed to be upset about the Americans were actually very much in favor of the Americans. They thought the Americans were on their side. It was really money that broke him. It wasn't the Americans. It was the economic strangulation of the port. They just went broke. They couldn't get the $12 million. They ran out of startup money. They crashed. They couldn't scale. He couldn't seize the means of production. He got politically outmaneuvered by the Treaty of Rapallo between the Italians and the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. They're like, why should we fight? Let's get rid of this idiot in Rijeka. We'll just crack him like a walnut. He's dangerous to you. He's dangerous to us. He's breaking the rules of nation states. He's making us look bad. If you want some border city, all you have to do is ask for us. We're Rome, you're Belgrade. We can trade these little towns. Who cares? We don't need you. They sent in the Navy. They sent in the Army. They blew a hole in D'Annunzio's headquarters. They tried to kill him. They hit him with a naval shell. He barely escaped being assassinated. They fought on barricades in the street. His top guy, an amazing character, went out with a stick in his hand on horseback because he didn't want to bear a gun against his fellow Italians. He went out on horseback with a stick and he stole a tank by beating up the 3 guys who were driving it and throwing it out, and he drove off. He drove off with the tank. It's all true, but it didn't help. The Occupy camp was done. It was all crushed. They were diplomatically, politically, and economically outmaneuvered. 100 years later, nobody's fucking heard of them.